The year is 1941. The snow falls silently over the endless plains of Russia, a stark white canvas stained with the blood of millions. For the soldiers of a German Wehrmacht, the dream of a swift victory had frozen solid. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had stalled within sight of the Kremlin spires. Just a few short months earlier, they had swept across Eastern Europe like an unstoppable tide. But now, the Russian winter was their true enemy. Every man was a ghost, wrapped in thin wool coats, their breath a white cloud in the minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit air. Engines froze solid, rifles jammed, and frostbite claimed more men than enemy bullets. On a historical timeline, this was where the German advance stopped. This was where the Red Army, battered and bruised, but bolstered by reinforcements from the east and the sheer will to survive, launched a desperate counterattack that would push the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow and ultimately change the course of the war. But this is not that history. This is a different timeline. A fragile, whispered, what if that changed everything? In this reality, as the German high command huddled in freezing bunkers, a different argument takes hold. Instead of a cautious, measured approach, a single, daring voice prevails. General Heinz Guderian, the master of Blitzkrieg, argues for one last, all-or-nothing gamble. Instead of waiting for reinforcements that may never come, he convinces the Supreme Command to divert the last remaining panzer divisions, the steel fists of the Wehrmacht, away from the bogged-down central front and onto a far-flung, unsuspecting flank. The plan is insane. It's a desperate roll of the dice in a game they are already losing. The target, the last exposed supply lines connecting Moscow to the outside world. Among the men chosen for this suicidal mission is a young panzer crewman named Klaus, just 19 years old, his face gaunt from weeks of starvation rations and the endless cold. His hands, caked in grease and grime, shake not from fear, but from the brutal chill that seeps into every fiber of his being. He looks at his tank, the panther he has named Iron Devil, and sees a tomb, its metal hull radiating a deathly cold. But he and his crew follow orders. They push forward. The grinding of their tank tracks a deafening roar in the silent, frozen forest. They are tired. They are cold. They are at the end of their rope. But what happened next would change everything. For days, they pushed. The snow was a blinding white wall. The cold was a physical thing, a creature that clawed at their skin. They didn't see a single Soviet soldier. It was too cold. Everyone was in hiding. This was a war against nature, and nature was winning. But their mission was a secret. The Soviets, focused on the main German push, had left this flank virtually undefended. Then, on a frigid morning, they broke through the tree line and saw it. The supply road, a long, thin lifeline of trucks and horse-drawn carriages stretching across the snow, carrying food, ammunition, and men. The German panzers, like wolves scenting blood, roared to life. For the Soviet forces, the sight was a nightmare. They had expected the attack to come from the front. Instead, it was a sudden, brutal blow from an unexpected direction. The trucks were incinerated. The men scattered, frozen in their tracks, unable to comprehend the speed and ferocity of the attack. Their last supply line was gone. Moscow was now truly isolated. Meanwhile, inside the city, a young Soviet sniper named Anya shivered behind shattered window, her rifle sight trained on the frozen street below. She watched as German reconnaissance patrols, emboldened by the news of the breakthrough, began to push into the city's outer districts. They were still far away, but their presence was a cold, dreadful promise. The news had spread like wildfire. The city was cut off. The enemy, who had been pushed back just days earlier, was now at their doorstep. Her commander told her to hold her position, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union, was about to fall. As the German forces converged on the city, the Soviet command structure shattered. A sense of panic, of utter defeat, swept through the ranks. Stalin, famously defiant, refused to leave the city, but with the last lines of communication severed, his orders became meaningless. The city, surrounded, starved and bombarded by a relentless artillery barrage, could not hold. For days, the fighting was brutal, a house-to-house, hand-to-hand struggle in the city's frozen ruins. But it was a doomed effort. The German forces, bolstered by the impossible victory, fought with a new, terrifying resolve. On December 21st, 1941, the unthinkable happened. German flags, adorned with the swastika, were raised over the Kremlin. The heart of the Soviet Union, the city that was meant to be the final defiant stand, had fallen. For a moment, the world held its breath. The defeat was more than just a military setback. It was a psychological and political collapse of a global superpower. Stalin's fate remained uncertain. Some said he was captured, others that he was killed in the final hours of the fighting. But his absence marked the beginning of the end. The Soviet Union, now without its capital and with its command structure in tatters, began to unravel. In the streets of a conquered Moscow, Klaus and his panzer crew stood among the ruins, the smoke of burning buildings a dark contrast to the pristine snow. He had survived. He and his comrades had done the impossible. He looked up at the flag over the Kremlin, a symbol of a victory that no one had believed was possible. But the feeling was not one of triumph. It was a cold, hollow emptiness. He had won, but what had he won? He didn't know it then, but this single, brutal victory had not ended the war. It had simply shifted the battleground. The world was now on the cusp of a terrifying new reality. A global empire with a power so absolute it could reshape the face of the earth itself. The news of Moscow's fall reached London as a chilling rumor before it became a cold, hard fact. For the British people, who had stood alone against the Nazi war machine for over a year, this was more than a distant defeat. It was the collapse of their last great ally. The Soviet Union, that vast, enigmatic landmass, had been the crucible where Germany's strength was supposed to be broken. Instead, it had been forged into something harder, more terrible. A sigh of collective dread swept across the island nation. The focus of the war, for so long divided, was now about to turn with full, terrifying force toward them. In the skies over Britain, Squadron Leader James Sterling, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, felt the shift like a drop in temperature. His Spitfire, the sleek, beautiful machine that had once been his shield, now felt fragile, a thin aluminum hope against an approaching storm. For months, the skies had been a little quieter. The Luftwaffe, busy on the Eastern Front, had sent fewer bombers, fewer fighters. They had held the line. They had won the first round. But now, intelligence reports from occupied Europe told a different story. Every German airbase, from the coast of France to the Netherlands, was a hive of activity. Thousands of new planes were being moved into position. The full might of the Third Reich was preparing for one final, devastating assault. This was no longer a battle for air superiority. This was a prelude to an invasion. The German High Command, now free from the frozen hellscape of Russia, dusted off its old invasion plans for Britain, Operation Salient. This time, there would be no mistakes. This time, they would have the full resources of the Wehrmacht at their disposal. The naval forces, which had been considered too weak, were now supplemented by captured Soviet and French vessels. The paratrooper divisions, once stretched thin, were now concentrated and ready. The plans were meticulous, brutal, and designed for absolute success. On the other side of the English Channel, in the occupied city of Calais, a young German infantryman named Hans Müller watched the endless parade of men and material. He had been a part of the invasion of Poland, of France, of the Soviet Union. He was a veteran at just 21. But this was different. This wasn't a rapid, sweeping advance through a continent. This was a static, grinding buildup. Every night, the sky was black with transport planes, and the sea was a mass of barges, warships, and submarines. Hans felt a knot of dread in his stomach. The English were an island people. They had the sea on their side. They had fought like devils in the Battle of Britain. Could they truly be defeated? But what happened next would prove that in a war of overwhelming force, even a nation's indomitable spirit could only go so far. The invasion began not with a grand naval landing, but with a week-long, relentless aerial bombardment of a scale the world had never seen. The historical Blitz was a terrifying act, but this was a cataclysm. Thousands of German bombers, wave after wave, pounded British cities. London, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Manchester were turned into fiery landscapes of rubble and despair. The RAF, outnumbered 10-1, fought with a desperate, suicidal bravery. James Sterling saw his fellow pilots fall from the sky like shattered birds. Their airfields were craters, their runways unusable. The radar stations, which had been the eyes of the nation, were systematically destroyed. Within days, the skies were cleared. The Lion was blinded. Its roar, for the first time, was silenced. On the night of September 14th, 1942, the first wave of German forces crossed the English Channel. The invasion was a masterstroke of coordinated terror. Paratroopers dropped in the dark of night, seized key bridges and communication centers. The German Navy, led by the repurposed battleships of the French fleet, engaged the remaining British destroyers and cruisers in a desperate and hopeless battle. On the beaches of Kent, the German infantry landed. The British coastal defenses, cobbled together with courage and limited resources, were overrun in a matter of hours. The sheer, overwhelming number of German troops was impossible to stop. In London, a mother named Eleanor clung to her 5-year-old son, Arthur, in a makeshift shelter beneath their home. For weeks, they had lived on thin rations and the hope that the bombs would one day stop. But now, the sound was different. It wasn't the distant drone of planes. It was the roar of tanks. The streets of their once vibrant city were a chaotic mass of screaming civilians and soldiers trying to make a last, hopeless stand. Eleanor had seen the newsreels of fallen Paris, but she had never imagined this. The Germans were here. They were in the streets. Her son, his face streaked with soot, asked her if the war was over. She had no answer. The fighting for London was brutal, house to house, and lasted for days. The government, under Winston Churchill, had made the impossible decision to evacuate what was left of its forces, its leaders, and the royal family to Canada. Churchill himself, refusing to surrender, broadcast a final, defiant message to the world before boarding a warship. "We shall never surrender," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "and we will fight them from across the oceans." But his words, defiant as they were, could not change the reality on the ground. On September 25th, 1942, German infantry marched down the Mall, their boots echoing in the silent, smoke-filled streets. German generals, with a cold, almost clinical triumph, posed for photographs in front of a shattered Buckingham Palace. The swastika, a symbol of conquest and tyranny, was raised over London. Britain had fallen, the last bastion of freedom in Europe. The nation that had defied all odds had been brought to its knees by an overwhelming force that had first crushed Russia. But for the German soldiers like Hans, there was no sense of triumph. The victory was hollow. The British people did not cheer. They did not wave white flags. They simply went to ground, their eyes burning with a silent, defiant hatred. This was not the end of the war, Hans realized. This was just the end of the beginning. The Lion had fallen, but its roar, though muted, would echo in the shadows, a promise of a fight yet to come. The world was now a chessboard, and a terrifying new power had just checkmated its most stubborn opponent. The new global order was about to be established, and its foundation would be built on the ruins of empires. With Moscow fallen and London a smoldering ruin, the world awoke to a new reality. The map had been torn up and redrawn, not in the quiet rooms of diplomacy, but in the brutal crucible of war. The British Empire, once the greatest global power, was a ghost, its vast territories left to fend for themselves. From the sands of the Sahara to the jungles of Southeast Asia, a power vacuum opened, and into it rushed the new masters of the world, the Axis powers. In the glittering halls of the German Chancellery, the atmosphere was one of triumphant disbelief. Hitler, once a fanatical underdog, was now the undisputed ruler of the European continent. The dream of Lebensraum, of a vast German empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals was no longer a madman's vision. It was a brutal reality. Puppet governments were installed in Paris and London, their leaders meekly signing away their nation's sovereignty. The Soviet Union, in its shattered remnants, was partitioned into vast, resource-rich territories to be colonized and purged according to the Nazi master plan. But what would happen when these victorious allies, their appetites now ravenous, turned to face each other? Across the Mediterranean, the Italian Empire, under Benito Mussolini, began to expand, a shadow of its Roman aspirations. With the Royal Navy defeated, Italian forces swept across North Africa, seizing British and French colonies with a swaggering, if unproven, sense of power. The Suez Canal, the vital artery connecting Europe to Asia, fell to Axis control, cementing their dominance over global trade. The Mediterranean, once a strategic prize, became an Italian lake. The world, reeling from the twin shocks of Moscow and London, watched in silent horror as the map continued to change with dizzying speed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Empire of Japan, emboldened by Germany's twin victories, unleashed its full force. The American fleet at Pearl Harbor was still a smoking memory, but the Japanese forces, no longer distracted by a potential fight with the U.S. and the Philippines, pushed deep into Southeast Asia. With the British Empire dissolved, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma fell in rapid succession. The vast, resource-rich lands of the British Raj, India, were now the prize. Indian nationalists, who had long chafed under British rule, found themselves in a new, terrifying position. Some saw the Japanese as liberators, but others saw them as just another colonizer, one with a far more brutal ideology. In a small office in Ottawa, Canada, a former British diplomat named Alastair Finch stared at a map. His world was gone. The map he had known, with its vast swathes of red-colored territory signifying British rule, was now a chaotic mess. The Union Jack had been lowered over London, and with it, the soul of the Commonwealth. He and other British officials had fled to Canada, a former dominion that was now the de facto capital of a government in exile. The Canadians, loyal but pragmatic, had welcomed them, but the fear was palpable. They were now a lone island in a world dominated by Axis power. Alastair's mission, once clear, was now a fool's errand: to convince the isolationist government in Washington, D.C. that the war was not over. But how do you rally a nation to fight a war that, for all intents and purposes, has already been lost? Alastair's pleas fell on deaf ears. For the United States, the situation was complex. President Roosevelt, a staunch anti-fascist, watched the global map with growing alarm. But America, still recovering from the Great Depression, was a deeply isolationist nation. The fall of Britain had terrified the American public, but had also solidified a dangerous belief that the oceans were a sufficient defense. The Atlantic and the Pacific were wide, deep moats. The American military was powerful, but untested in a global war. The question wasn't if they could win, but if they should even try. And what happened next would change the answer to that question forever. The victory had created a new, uneasy partnership. While Germany dominated Europe, Italy controlled the Mediterranean, and Japan ruled Asia, a new kind of Cold War began to emerge. The victorious Axis powers were not true allies, they were rivals. Their ideologies clashed. Germany's brutal racial purges were at odds with Japan's own imperial ambitions. Mussolini, ever the opportunist, eyed German territory with suspicion. The New World Order was a house of cards, built on a foundation of conquest and greed. It was a world of shifting alliances and whispered betrayals. The world held its breath, but no one could truly grasp the scale of the change. A Nazi-dominated Europe, a Japanese-controlled Asia, a divided and fearful America. The old order was gone, replaced by a new map drawn in blood and ambition. The United States, once the bastion of democratic ideals, was now faced with an impossible choice: to stand alone against a seemingly unstoppable global empire, or to become a vassal state in a world where freedom was nothing more than a historical memory. The world was on the precipice, and the only question was whether the American giant would choose to fight or to fall. The world held its breath as the dust settled over a conquered Europe. But in the United States, the reaction was not one of mobilization, but of a profound national fear. The fall of Britain had proven the oceans were no longer an impassable barrier. The Nazis, who were once a distant madman's threat, were now a global empire with a navy and air force that dwarfed any other. President Roosevelt, who had tirelessly tried to prepare the nation for war, found his influence waning. A powerful new isolationist movement, far more virulent than its pre-war predecessor, swept the nation. Its message was simple and terrifying. Europe had fallen. Asia was lost. We were alone. And the only thing left to do was to protect ourselves. A young man in Chicago named Leo felt the change in the air. He worked at a munitions factory, but the talk wasn't about building bombs for Britain anymore. It was about building bombs for America. His friend, a young pilot in the Air Corps, was being retrained not for a mission over Europe, but for one of national defense to patrol the vast, lonely coastlines. The old posters with their calls to patriotism and sacrifice were replaced by new ones. A silhouette of a tank with the slogan, "The Fortress of Freedom." The mood was a strange mix of defiant patriotism and paralyzing dread. America was preparing for a war it hoped would never come. The government, under immense pressure, acquiesced. The Roosevelt administration pivoted from a war footing to a defensive one, a strategy now known to history as the Continental Wall. Billions of dollars were poured into a military buildup of unprecedented scale. But this was not an army of conquest. It was an army of defense. Coastal cities were fortified with new anti-aircraft batteries and submarine nets. The Navy built massive new carrier fleets, not to challenge the Axis in the Atlantic or Pacific, but to defend the seaboards of North and South America. The skies were patrolled by a new generation of long-range interceptors. The United States was sealing itself off, creating a fortress, a last lonely bastion of democracy in a world gone mad. But what they couldn't see was that the wall was already breached. While America built its physical defenses, the Axis powers were waging a new kind of war. German U-boats, now operating from captured ports in Britain and France, prowled the Atlantic, sinking American merchant ships with impunity. Japanese submarines, operating from occupied islands in the Pacific, did the same. This was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding blockade designed to strangle the American economy and force them to the negotiating table. Saboteurs and spies, trained in the arts of espionage, slipped across the borders with Canada and Mexico. Propaganda, far more insidious than the old war posters, was broadcast in Spanish and English, speaking of a glorious new world order and the futility of American resistance. Leo, in his munitions factory, would hear the whispers: a warehouse fire in the port of Boston, a train derailment in California. These were not accidents. They were the silent battles of a new conflict. The FBI and a new secretive intelligence agency worked around the clock, but it was a losing battle. The sheer scale of the Axis network was overwhelming. He saw the refugees, too, arriving from Europe. Frenchmen, Poles, Russians, and Brits who had made the long, desperate journey across the Atlantic. They came with stories of brutal occupation and systemic persecution, stories that the isolationist media dismissed as propaganda. Meanwhile, in a heavily guarded facility in the New Mexico desert, a brilliant scientist named Dr. Alan Foster worked on a secret project, codenamed Trinity. Historically, this had been the Manhattan Project, a race to build a weapon to win a war. In this reality, the mission was different. The goal was no longer a weapon to defeat the Nazis, but a weapon to ensure they never dared to attack. The purpose of the atomic bomb had shifted from one of conquest to one of pure deterrence. Dr. Foster saw the moral ambiguity in his work. He was building the end of the world, not to save it, but to protect it from an enemy that was not, as of yet, at his door. He believed in what he was doing, but the silence and the secrecy, the knowledge of the global darkness that lay just beyond their borders, ate away at his soul. The New World Order was settling into a grim stasis. The United States, with its continental wall, was a solitary island of freedom in a fascist ocean. The Axis powers, bloated with their victories, were a constant, menacing presence. They didn't need to invade. They just needed to wait. The economic pressure, the constant espionage, the psychological warfare, it was all designed to wear America down, to make it bend to their will. The United States, for its part, was a nation in conflict with itself. The defiant spirit of the American people was still there, but it was buried under layers of fear and isolationism. The question was not if the wall would hold, but if the spirit of the people behind it would break. The world held its breath, a ticking bomb in a fragile truce. But it was only a matter of time before the fundamental clash of ideologies, democracy versus tyranny, would erupt into a final, apocalyptic conflict. America had built its wall, a fortress in a fascist world, but it couldn't build a wall high enough to keep out the coming storm. The peace that settled over the world after the fall of London was a grim, silent thing. The global stage, once a chaotic theater of war, was now eerily still, the new Axis empires consolidating their power. But this was not the peace of reconciliation. It was the silence of a mass grave, a world where the worst had already happened, and it was only getting worse. For the architects of the Third Reich, the victories on the battlefield were not the end of the war. They were merely the means to an end. The ultimate goal, the true master plan, could now be implemented without opposition. In the shattered remnants of the Soviet Union, the German army, no longer fighting on a front, became an army of occupation. And with them came the true face of the Nazi regime. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, and behind them, the bureaucrats of genocide. The vast, resource-rich lands of the Ukraine and Belarus were to be emptied of their undesirable populations, Jews, Slavs, communists, and anyone who did not fit the Aryan mold. The historical Holocaust was a horror of unimaginable scale, but in this timeline, with the German war machine no longer needing to divert resources to fighting a global conflict, the final solution was accelerated and expanded with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. The trains that once carried troops and supplies to the front now carried human cargo to new, purpose-built extermination camps, not just in Poland, but deep within the new German territories. The names Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor became whispers of a hell on earth, a horrifying reality that few outside of the conquered land believed. A young woman named Sarah, who had once lived a simple life in a small village outside Kiev, found herself crammed into a cattle car with her parents and her younger brother, the air thick with the smell of fear and sickness. The war had seemed distant, a conflict for soldiers on a far-off front. But now, it had arrived at her doorstep, not with a roar of tanks, but with the cold, methodical thud of a closing boxcar door. The destination was a place of black smoke and barbed wire, a place of dehumanization so complete it defied description. Her story, and the stories of millions like her, were not just about survival, but about a struggle to hold onto a shred of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Every day was a fight against starvation, against disease, against the cold indifference of the guards. But the most terrifying weapon of the camps was not the gas chambers or the guard towers. It was the systematic destruction of hope. For the Nazis, this was not just a war of conquest. It was a war of extinction, and it was not limited to the Jews. The Roma people, the political dissidents, the physically and mentally disabled, all were marked for destruction. As the German Empire expanded, so too did its genocidal policies. The horrors of the gas chambers were not just a European tragedy, they were an ideology. But what happened when this ideology of racial purity met another on the other side of the globe? Across the vastness of Asia, the Japanese Empire was implementing its own brutal version of racial and cultural purification. The Japanese Imperial Army, with its own belief in a superior race, saw the conquered lands of China, Korea, and Southeast Asia not as colonies, but as resources to be exploited and purified. The atrocities of the rape of Nanking, a historical fact, were not an aberration but a template. In this new world order, the Axis allies, despite their political rivalries, found a terrible common ground in their shared belief in racial supremacy. The world, now carved up into spheres of influence, was becoming a series of interconnected prisons, each with its own brand of systematic cruelty. In a captured city in Burma, an old man who had spent his life fighting for Indian independence saw a new, terrifying reality. The British, for all their faults, had been a known evil. The Japanese, with their brutal policies of forced labor and collective punishment, were a different, far more lethal kind of master. He saw the systematic destruction of entire villages, the public executions, the complete disregard for human life. He realized, with a sense of profound and terrible irony, that he had traded one form of tyranny for another. The chilling, almost casual cruelty was everywhere. In a German-controlled city in a conquered Russia, a young German SS officer, Hans Richter, sat in his office, his boots polished, his uniform immaculate. He was not a monster in his own mind. He was a manager. He oversaw the transportation schedules, the allocation of resources, the paperwork of death. He saw the victims not as people, but as numbers, as a problem to be solved. He believed, with a terrible sincerity, that he was building a better world, a cleaner, purer one. And in his chilling lack of empathy, he represented a far greater evil than any single act of violence. This was a master plan executed by men who saw themselves not as murderers, but as engineers of a new world. The master race had won its empire, but in doing so, it had unleashed a darkness that no victory could justify. The world was now a place of silent terror, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with the ghosts of the fallen. But in the silent camps and the conquered cities, a flame of defiance, born of unimaginable suffering, was just beginning to burn. The brutal efficiency of the Reich had created an enemy that was not a government or an army, but an idea, the idea that the human spirit, even when facing complete annihilation, will always find a way to fight back. The world, for all its new, grim order, was not silent. Beneath the iron fist of the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire, a new kind of war was brewing, a battle fought in whispers and shadows, in the cold of the Russian forests and the narrow alleys of Paris. The Nazi victory, absolute as it was, had created a silent but powerful enemy, the resistance. It was a phantom, an unstoppable force born from the ashes of defeat, a global phoenix rising from the very fires of tyranny. In the occupied streets of Paris, a young art student named Mark now worked a different kind of canvas. He was a member of the French Resistance, his hands no longer used for a brush, but for forging documents, for passing on coded messages, and for placing small, inconspicuous explosive devices on German transport trains. The Gestapo, with its network of spies and informants, was everywhere. Every shadow was a potential informant, every glance a sign of suspicion. Mark had lost his father in the final days of the war, a victim of a Gestapo firing squad. Now, his fight was not about nation-states or grand strategies. It was a personal, visceral war, a silent promise to his father's memory that the soul of France would not die. His resistance cell was a diverse group, a baker who hid Jewish families in his cellar, a young woman who worked as a German secretary and copied documents, and a former French army officer who provided them with tactical knowledge. They communicated through coded messages hidden in newspapers, through forged ration cards, and through the secret radio broadcasts beamed from a far-off place called Canada. For a long time, these broadcasts were just voices in the night, a distant hope. But now they were a lifeline. Across the ocean, in a hidden facility in a small town in Canada, the British government in exile had turned into a command center for a global insurgency. They called themselves the Free British Commonwealth, and from a clandestine radio station, they broadcast messages of hope and defiance. Their Air Force, now flying American-made bombers, would perform daring, low-altitude drops of supplies to resistance cells across Europe, weapons, radios, food, medicine. The American government, officially neutral, looked the other way. The Continental Wall was a public show, but in the shadows, a cold war of espionage and sabotage was already in full swing. This wasn't a war for victory. It was a war to keep the flame alive. In the English countryside, a former sergeant of the British Army named Thomas led a small, isolated band of partisans. He and his men were a forgotten army, a few dozen soldiers who had refused to surrender and had melted into the forests of Kent. The German occupation was brutal but efficient. They had a massive garrison, but they could not be everywhere at once. Thomas and his men were the ghosts in the machine. They sabotaged German supply convoys, blew up railway lines, and ambushed patrols. Their existence was a constant, irritating thorn in the side of the new occupiers. The Germans, to their bewilderment, found themselves fighting a war not of conquest, but of counterinsurgency, a war without a front line, an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. The same story was being written in 1,000 different places. In the vast, unforgiving forests of Russia, the remnants of the Red Army and countless civilians had formed massive, sprawling partisan groups. Led by a hardened veteran named Alexei, they waged a brutal, no-quarter war against the German occupiers. Their enemy was not just the German army, but the cold and the hunger. But their spirit was unshakable. They lived for vengeance, for every German supply convoy they destroyed, for every small victory that reminded them that the enemy was not invincible. But what would happen when the Reich, sensing this new, global threat, turned its full, terrifying attention to stamping it out? The Germans, for all their military might, found themselves in a new kind of conflict. They could defeat an army, but they could not defeat an idea. The resistance was not a cohesive force. It was a network of individual cells, each operating on its own, its existence a constant, maddening threat. The Nazis responded with a brutal, predictable fury. They increased the use of torture. They took hostages. They burned villages to the ground. For every act of sabotage, a dozen innocent lives were taken in reprisal. But this only fed the fire. Every victim became a martyr. Every act of reprisal a new reason to fight. The resistance was not about winning the war in a conventional sense. It was about making the occupation a living hell. It was about making every German soldier look over his shoulder. It was about showing the world, and more importantly, the United States, that the fight was not over. They were the voice of a conquered people, a whisper of defiance in a world that had fallen silent. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes, a new kind of army, a new kind of war. And it was a battle that would be fought not on a grand battlefield, but in the shadows, a secret war for the soul of the world. The global resistance, for all its courage, was fighting a war of attrition and sabotage, 1,000 tiny cuts against a monstrous enemy. But while the occupied peoples fought with whatever they could find, a rusty knife, a hidden radio, a defiant spirit, the Third Reich was fighting a different war altogether. With the resources of an entire continent at its disposal, and with no major fronts to bleed its resources, the Nazi state turned its full, fanatical attention to a singular goal: technological supremacy. The Reich was not just a military power. It was a technological juggernaut, a future of steel and terror that was being built piece by painstaking piece in its secret factories and laboratories. In a vast, secret complex carved into the side of a mountain, a brilliant German rocket scientist named Werner felt a familiar, sickening mixture of pride and dread. He had been a part of the V2 program, the weapon that had rained terror on London. But that was a child's toy compared to what he was building now. He oversaw the development of the V4, a long-range, intercontinental ballistic missile. It was a weapon of unthinkable destructive power, a rocket that could reach the east coast of the United States. Werner wasn't a true believer in the Nazi ideology. He was a scientist, a man driven by a singular, burning desire to push the boundaries of human knowledge. He was fascinated by the physics of propulsion, the mathematics of orbital trajectories, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of a rocket that could cross an ocean. He told himself that his work was for the glory of science, not for the terror of a regime. But the truth was far more complex and far more chilling. His complex was powered by the labor of thousands of prisoners, Jews, Poles, Russians, political dissidents, and forced laborers. In the cold, cavernous tunnels of the factory, a French engineer named Jean toiled beside hundreds of others, his body emaciated, his spirit clinging to a fragile hope. He and his fellow prisoners, in a desperate act of sabotage, would slip in tiny imperfections, a loose bolt here, a faulty weld there. They knew they could not stop the machine, but they could slow it down, make it less reliable. Jean would look at the immense, gleaming rockets, the pinnacle of human ingenuity, and see a symbol of his captivity. His forced labor was a constant, living reminder of what happens when science and power are fused without a conscience. But the V4 was not the only wonder weapon being developed. The Luftwaffe, now a global air force, was developing a new generation of jet fighters and bombers. The historical Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was now being mass-produced in a perfected form, with no Allied air force to challenge them. The German jets, a silent, swift, and terrifying menace, patrolled the skies. The sight of them in the air was an act of psychological warfare, a constant reminder to the occupied peoples that they were being watched from above by a silent, all-powerful enemy. The world, for all its resistance, was being suffocated by a technological superiority that felt insurmountable. But the most terrifying secret of the new Reich was not in the sky or in the sea. It was in a hidden research facility in the Black Forest. Historically, the German nuclear program had been a fragmented, underfunded failure. In this new reality, with the world's most brilliant scientists either working for the Reich or cut off from vital resources, the program had a different outcome. Led by a ruthless pragmatist, the program was given a single, unifying mission and limitless resources. The goal was not a power source or a scientific marvel. It was a weapon. They called it Die Glock, the bell, a nod to its mysterious shape and terrifying power. The American isolationist government, with its massive continental wall, was not so blind that it didn't see what was happening. Their own nuclear program, now a desperate race to catch up, was running on fumes and a growing sense of dread. The intelligence reports from the resistance were a chilling confirmation. The German scientists were close. The Manhattan Project, now in a losing race, was a frantic, desperate effort to build a deterrent against an enemy that already had a running start. But what would happen when the world, with bated breath, learned that the ultimate weapon was now in their hands? On a cold morning in the winter of 1944, a group of scientists, Werner among them, watched from a safe distance as the first test of Die Glock was conducted in a remote, barren valley. A blinding flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, erupted on the horizon. The ground shook. The air tasted of ozone and death. A great, billowing mushroom cloud rose into the sky, a terrifying omen that signaled the true dawn of the new Reich. The power of the sun itself was now a weapon, and it was in the hands of the very men who had brought the world to its knees. The old world was gone, and the new world lived in the shadow of a mushroom cloud. The resistance fighters, the civilians, the isolated governments, they had all been fighting for a future that was already doomed. The new Reich had not just defeated armies and conquered nations. It had conquered the very nature of conflict itself. A new age had begun, an age of technological terror, and it was a battle that no one, not even the United States, was prepared to fight. The world had not ended in a flash of light, but in a long, slow descent into a new kind of darkness. The victories on the battlefield and the terrifying new weapons in the hands of the Third Reich had settled into a grim, daily reality. The world was now at peace, but it was a peace of total control, a suffocating blanket of totalitarian rule. Life under the swastika was not a life of freedom or joy, but a performance, a constant act of playing a part to survive in a world where every neighbor was a potential informant, and every spoken word a potential crime. In the once vibrant streets of Paris, A young woman named Marie walked with her head down. She worked as a clerk for a German-run supply office, a necessary compromise to feed her family. She had once dreamed of being a dancer, of the bright lights and music of the city. Now, the music was replaced by the guttural commands of German soldiers, and the lights were muted by a constant, oppressive curfew. She had to smile, to nod, to pretend to agree with the pamphlets she was forced to distribute. Pamphlets that spoke of a glorious new Europe and the eradication of the undesirable races. She knew these were lies, but to show any sign of dissent was a death sentence. Her life, once her own, was now a performance. But what would happen when the strain of the performance became too much to bear? In this new world, moral compromises were a daily necessity. The choice was not between good and evil, but between survival and death. Neighbors informed on neighbors for an extra ration of bread. Friends betrayed friends for the promise of a promotion or a warmer apartment. The black market, run by a mix of desperate civilians and corrupt German officials, was the true economy of the occupied world. Everyone was a player in a grand, silent game of survival, and the rules were simple: trust no one. The constant, low-level fear was more effective than any army. It turned people against each other. It made them complicit in their own oppression. But even for the victors, life was not a paradise. In a small town in Germany, a young soldier named Klaus, the same tank gunner who had fought in the frozen hell of Russia, returned home. He was a hero to his community. The propaganda machine had turned his victory into a glorious triumph. He was paraded through the streets, given medals, and hailed as a symbol of the new Reich. But in his eyes, there was no glory, only the silent horror of what he had seen and what he had done. He would sit in the evenings, staring into the fire, unable to speak of the atrocities he had witnessed, the terrible price of victory. His wife, a true believer, would talk of their son, who was being raised in the Hitler Youth, of the promise of a pure, prosperous future for the German people. But Klaus knew the truth. The prosperity was built on the backs of slaves. The purity was built on a mountain of bones. He had won the war, but he had lost his soul. The New World Order was a system of total indoctrination, a terrifying success of social engineering. From the moment they were born, children were taught the virtues of racial purity, of German superiority, and of blind obedience to the state. All media, from the radio to the newspapers, was state-controlled, telling the same story of a glorious future and a necessary past. The books of the Old World, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Austen, were burned, replaced by new, approved texts. Art, music, and film were all used to enforce the totalitarian ideology. The goal was not just to rule the people's bodies, but to conquer their minds. But even in this world of total control, there were cracks. In occupied London, a young man named Arthur, a former student of history, would meet with a small, secret group in a hidden cellar. They had no weapons. They had no radio. They had only books smuggled in from a forgotten, less conquered world. They would read aloud from the classics of democratic thought, from the Declaration of Independence, from the works of poets who sang of freedom. Their acts were small, silent, and deeply dangerous. They were not fighting a war of guns and bombs, but a war of ideas, a stubborn, beautiful refusal to let the human spirit die. They were a living protest against a system that sought to control every thought and every feeling. They knew that a world built on fear and lies could not last forever. The Nazis had built an empire of steel and propaganda, a new world order that seemed unshakable. They had defeated armies, conquered nations, and built weapons of unthinkable power. But in their hubris, they had forgotten the one thing they could not control: the human heart. The new world was a performance, but behind the masks, in the silent places, and in the secret whispers, a new kind of rebellion was taking shape. The true battle for the soul of the world was just beginning. The world outside was a picture of a total, crushing victory. The United States had built its wall, and the global resistance was a phantom enemy, a distant whisper of a failed hope. But within the core of the victorious Third Reich, the picture was very different. With no external enemies left to fight, The most powerful men in the world, the architects of the New Order, turned their knives on each other. The very ideology that had led to their victory became the seed of their downfall. The new empire, for all its power and its terrifying technological advancements, was not a well-oiled machine. It was a chaotic, brutal, and self-destructive regime rotting from the inside out. The Führer, once the unquestioned leader, had become a distant, reclusive figure, a living monument more than a ruler. In the resulting power vacuum, the most ambitious of his lieutenants began a vicious, silent civil war. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, saw himself as the true heir, the keeper of the racial master plan. He had built a state within a state, a shadow empire of terror and absolute loyalty, its power extending from the concentration camps to the far reaches of the occupied territories. But Hermann Göring, once the designated successor, still held control of the Luftwaffe and a vast industrial empire. He saw Himmler's fanaticism as a threat to the stability of the Reich. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, played his own devious game, pitting one rival against the other, ensuring that no one could ever challenge his own control over the hearts and minds of the German people. In a plush office in Berlin, an ambitious SS general named Otto felt the tension like a physical weight in the air. He was a protege of Himmler, and he saw himself as a key player in the coming struggle. He was no longer concerned with the affairs of the conquered lands. His world was now a claustrophobic dance of ambition and paranoia. He would receive coded messages about Göring's movements, about Bormann's latest plot, about the rumors surrounding the Führer's health. His true war was not against the resistance, but against his own countrymen. He would send out his best men not to hunt partisans, but to gather intelligence on his rivals. The new Reich, so unified in its conquest, was now splintering into rival fiefdoms. But the most glaring flaw of the empire was not its internal power struggles, but its impossible scale. The vastness of the conquered territories was a never-ending drain. The German army, historically a conquering force, had become a police force stretched thin across a continent. In the distant, unforgiving landscape of the Ural Mountains, a German soldier named Dieter, a veteran of the Moscow campaign, patrolled a small, isolated garrison. His war was not one of glory, but of never-ending, brutal counterinsurgency. The Russian partisans were a phantom enemy. They would appear out of nowhere, destroy a supply depot, and disappear back into the vastness of the forests. His men were tired, demoralized, and constantly on edge. The promise of an easy peace had turned into a never-ending, grinding occupation. He had won the war, but he was now fighting an endless battle he knew could never be won. The empire, so dependent on conquest, had no sustainable economic model for peace. The so-called prosperity of the Reich was a fragile illusion, built on the stolen wealth of the conquered nations and the blood and sweat of millions of forced laborers. The system was unsustainable. The logistics of feeding and clothing a continent, while a global resistance sabotaged every supply line, was an economic nightmare. The black market, once a hidden enterprise, was now the true, grinding gears of the European economy. The illusion of a powerful, prosperous empire was beginning to crack. The power struggles at the top began to leak down to the streets. Rival factions would secretly turn on each other, their agents fighting small, vicious shadow wars in the heart of Berlin and other major cities. Mysterious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and sudden, violent purges became a fact of life. The average German, who had once cheered on the victory parades, now looked over their shoulder, their blind loyalty giving way to a gnawing sense of fear. The empire, for all its outward show of strength, was falling victim to its own internal poison. The seeds of self-destruction had been planted from the very beginning, a flaw in the very ideology that had fueled its rise. A system built on a foundation of blind obedience and fanatical ambition could only hold together as long as there was a single, external enemy to rally against. With the world conquered, the enemy was now within. The new Reich, in its hubris, had created the one enemy it could never defeat itself. The men who had conquered the world now fought among themselves for the scraps, their own ambition a cancer eating away at the heart of their empire. The world was on the precipice, and the stage was set for a cataclysmic global event, a final battle that would determine not just the fate of an empire, but the future of all of humanity. The new Reich had won the world, but it had created the one enemy it could never defeat: itself. The seeds of its self-destruction, planted in the very soil of its ideological victory, were beginning to bear a terrible fruit. The internal power struggles, long a festering wound, finally erupted in a public, catastrophic crisis. The whispers of betrayal became accusations. The secret purges became a civil war among the highest echelons of the Nazi elite. Himmler and Göring, with their private armies and rival ambitions, turned on each other. The German military, long a reluctant partner in the regime's brutality, was forced to choose a side. This was not a revolution. It was the collapse of a house built on sand. In his small, miserable garrison in the Ural Mountains, the disillusioned German soldier, Dieter, felt the end approaching. The radio messages from Berlin were a chaotic mess of competing orders and hysterical pronouncements. His commanding officer, a man who had once been a true believer, now looked gaunt and terrified. The supply lines, once reliable, had stopped. The partisans, once a manageable nuisance, were now a constant, emboldened presence, their attacks growing in frequency and ferocity. Dieter and his men were a forgotten army in a forgotten war. The empire was unraveling, and they were at the frayed edges of it. One night, a partisan leader, a grizzled old veteran named Alexei, found him in the dead of night, not with a rifle, but with a piece of bread and a flask of vodka. The war was not between them anymore. It was between the living and the dead. Back in the heart of the Reich, the scientist Werner watched his life's work come to a terrifying end. The wonder weapons, the V-4 rockets, were now being used not against distant enemies, but against each other. Göring's forces used them to bombard Himmler's strongholds, and in retaliation, Himmler's SS units unleashed them on German cities loyal to Göring. Werner watched in silent horror, his face streaked with tears, as the brilliant machines he had created to intimidate the world were used to tear his own world apart. He realized, with a soul-shattering clarity, that he had not been a creator, but an instrument of destruction. He had built the tools for a regime's victory, only for them to become the instruments of its suicide. For the United States, the collapse of the Third Reich was not a cause for celebration, but for a terrible, monumental choice. The Continental Wall had held. The Axis had not been able to conquer them. But now, with the world in a state of chaotic implosion, the time for neutrality was over. President Roosevelt, now frail and tired, addressed a shocked nation. He spoke not of conquest, but of liberation. He spoke of the need to rebuild, to save the millions suffering under the rule of the now collapsing Axis powers. The American war machine, so long held in check, was finally unleashed, not for a war of ideology, but for a war of humanity. American forces crossed the Atlantic, not to conquer a continent, but to liberate one. Their targets were not German cities, but German command centers, communication hubs, and the concentration camps. They were met not with fierce opposition, but with scenes of unspeakable horror and the cheers of starving, beaten people. The master plan had been a success, a systematic genocide on a global scale, and the world was now faced with the full, sickening cost of Axis victory. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire, too, was on the brink of collapse. The American forces, now fighting a war of liberation, pushed back against an empire that had overstretched itself, its cruelty and ambition having created a network of internal enemies. In Paris, the young resistance fighter, Mark, felt the end coming not with a roar, but with a quiet sense of disbelief. The German soldiers were no longer the arrogant, all-powerful force he had known. They were nervous, disoriented, and afraid. The radio broadcasts from London and Washington were no longer just whispers of hope. They were the promises of a new dawn. Mark and his cell emerged from the shadows, a hidden army that had outlasted an empire. Their victory was not a parade, but a long, tearful reunion with a world they had thought was lost forever. In the end, the New World Order, the one forged in the fires of a Nazi victory, collapsed not because of a single grand military campaign, but because of its own fundamental flaws. The ideology of hate and racial superiority was so total, so absolute, that it was incapable of compromise, of adaptation, of building a true, stable society. It had conquered a world, but in doing so, it had created a million enemies. And in the end, it was those enemies, the resistance fighters, the disillusioned soldiers, the starving civilians, and the American colossus that had finally woken up, that brought it down. The world that could have been, the world of 1,000 years of darkness, was averted not by a single act, but by a million tiny ones. This is the world that we could have lived in. A world where the greatest of all human virtues, the spirit of defiance, was the only thing that stood between a brutal, totalitarian empire and the total end of freedom. The heroes of this story are not the generals or the kings, but the nameless civilians, the brave resistance fighters, and the quiet souls who simply refuse to give up. Their story is a reminder that history is not a foregone conclusion. It is a choice, and it is a battle that is fought not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of every person. The new Reich had won the war, but in the end, the human spirit had won the future.